Hi, I'm Steve Zimmerman. I'm the aircraft commander on dock, the B-29 you see behind me, and it's what you're going to watch in the video coming up. Thanks for coming out. As you can imagine, this is a huge undertaking to keep this airplane going. It's about $10,000 an hour to operate it. It's about a little over $40,000 to fill it up with gas right now. So it takes a lot of money, a lot of riders, a lot of trips to pay for all that. And it's you guys that do that. People that come out to fly it, come to air shows and pay a fee to get in and do cockpit tours and buy our t-shirts or whatever it is. All that money goes into the airplane. We're all volunteers. We do it because we love it.
B-29 Dock is one of only 2 flying B-29 Superfortresses still left in the world today. And its mission is to honor the greatest generation, honor the men, women who designed, built, and flew these airplanes, and also maintain them to protect our freedom both here at home and overseas. And we are so honored to be able to carry on that legacy, and hopefully we inspire the next generation of aviation lovers to go and protect our freedom and work in the aviation field.
The airplane's considered experimental. So really what that means, it doesn't have a lot of the safety features like a big airplane would have. We're a little bigger than a 737, but we have no interior. So you're going to see cables and pulleys and wires and all sorts of stuff in there to bump your head on. So be careful when you're moving around, what you're grabbing. If you're pulling on those cables, you're flying the airplane, and Dan will get extremely mad because he wants to fly. So once we do get it airborne and we get through our checklist, we're going to say passengers are free to move about. You can get up and move around, but if you're in the front, you need to stay in the front. If you're in the back, you need to stay in the back. In other words, you can't crawl through the tunnel in flight. If you want to do that once we get back on the ground, you're more than welcome to. If you're in the back and you want to go to the tail gunner section, it is a crawl back there, but you're more than welcome to go back. Check out where we've been instead of where we're going. It's worth going back there. It was pretty smooth earlier, and I think it'll be smooth now, so you shouldn't have any trouble going back there. Just don't stay back too long. We'll be up about 30 minutes in case everybody wants to go back there, give everybody a chance. If you're in the front, do we have a bombardier? You're the bombardier. Okay, you need to stay in your seat the whole time. So when we tell everybody else to get up, you need to stay there. Because I always tell everybody, if you get up, somebody else gets in that seat, you're not going to get it back. So
they dance. How about that?
Yeah, yeah. It's actually an FAA rule. Can't have people cross the flight deck. But the rest of you, get up, move around, check out every seat. These were 18, 19-year-old kids flying this thing. Oldest guy in the aircraft was probably the aircraft commander. He was probably 23 or 24 years old. So think what it might have been like. These guys were on 14, 16-hour mission, dark, over the water, being shot at, all that stuff. So it's really amazing what they did.
All right, so if you want to, you can come sit up here. She can sit there, and then I'll talk you guys through how to start these engines, okay? So a lot of places that we take the B-29 dock are just not designed to handle a B-29. It's got such a massive wingspan, it's a little wider than the 737. It's got those massive propellers out there, especially out on the outboard engines. And what happens is that so many of the taxiways are built to today's standards, today's aircraft. It's just too small for our B-29. So as we take the airplane up north and we get into taxiways that are built for today's more modern airplanes and taller lights to compensate for the snow, what we run into is that those big 16 feet 7-inch diameter propellers hang out into the grass and over those lights and signage and whatnot that other airplanes would never have an issue with. So we end up having to shut down the outboard engines, and then what we'll have to do is kind of index the propellers where they make an X to give additional ground clearance, because we've only got 18 inches of clearance out there. So it limits us on what we can do. So like for today's ride, for instance, where they parked us, they parked us over one light, forward of another light. So what we have to do is I've got to start all 4 engines. We've got to warm the oil. You know, there's 75 gallons of oil behind each engine. That takes a lot of time to warm up that 60 weight oil. Plus build some cylinder head temperature. So I had to start 3 of the engines. Then we had to move forward about 20 feet to get over that light, start the other outboard engine, let everything warm up. We did our run-up checks to make sure the engines are all good, the propellers are all doing what they're supposed to do. And then, as you would not expect for an aircraft, we had to shut the outboard engines off. And then I had to index the propellers to get more ground clearance so that we could taxi through the taxiways out to the runway, and then was finally able to have enough clearance below the outboard engines to actually start the engines back up. And then again, as you remember on the flight, I had to run the engines back up, do one last check on the runway before we took off for flight. And I know that sounds out of the ordinary, but as you operate this B-29, that's normal operations, normal things that you run into across the country, keeping this thing flying. Both the pilot, co-pilot, and flight engineers all have throttles, all right? The left seat pilot actually has manifold pressure gauges, which are going to give you your power references, and they have tachometers that show you the RPMs of your propellers, and that's it. I have everything else behind. I'm the only one that can start them, stop them. I have all the detailed gauges, all the dynamics of everything you need to know about the engines is back in my panel. And so how this works, you saw today, I started them, I'll do the run-up checks, they'll taxi the airplane out, I'll set the initial takeoff power, and I don't know if you can see around the side when Dan was using the outboard throttles to get us going down the runway, and then once we hit 80 miles an hour, he called the throttles back to me for me to take over and apply all the power. So that's how it works. It's a very crew-coordinated airplane. There's just so much going on with those engines. They're complex. That propeller assembly is hard to manage, and you can't fly the airplane and manage all four of those engines. So hence the two people, each one having to do a different part of that job. And then we just coordinate what it is through either predetermined power settings or phases of flight. I'm watching our airspeed just like Dan is. I know when he needs more power, less power. And then as you heard us coming in, he's just calling power back, and I'm making all the necessary adjustments with the engines or propellers until we come down into the flare, and then I pull them back and we land. So, but the other part of that too, back to the wartime though too, if something had happened to the flight engineer, the pilots had minimal control of the throttle, so you could still, in all theory, get home and land the airplane.
So I'm one of the fortunate ones that gets to fly the B-29, and it's a little different than anything else you would fly, but in the end it's an airplane. It can be heavy on the controls. We have no hydraulics except for the brakes. So all the controls are cable driven. We have no nose wheel steering. Taxiing is one of the hardest things we do. Differential power and brakes. Aircraft runs very smooth. It's 4 powerful engines. We got about 2,200 horsepower per engine. So flying it, some people describe it as maneuvering an elephant, but it's not that bad when you're going slow, maybe a little bit like that. You can do a lot of control movement, but at higher speeds, it's a very maneuverable airplane.
So our mission with Doc is to allow people to get up close and personal with a B-29 and really immerse themselves in the B-29 experience. You can do that when we come out on the road and climb up inside the airplane and sit in the seats and listen to our volunteers and they tell the stories. You can also be part of our ride flight experience, and you can ride in the airplane, you can sit in the seats that our nation's heroes sat in, and really immerse yourself in the crew, being a part of a B-29 crew. It's really a unique opportunity. Everyone can see an airplane fly overhead. We've all seen airplanes fly, we've all seen warbirds fly overhead, but it's not very common that you get to actually crawl inside of a B-29 warbird, you get to fly in it, and so we're just so very honored to be able to do that. And through those operations, that's how we keep these airplanes restored and keep them airworthy. If you go out and buy an air show ticket, you buy a t-shirt, you buy a hat, maybe it's from B-29 Doc, maybe it's from some other warbird, but if you buy that air show ticket, essentially you're helping all of us stay in the air. If you buy a ride flight ticket, all that money goes right back into preserving our nation's history, telling those stories of the greatest generation, preserving their legacy, and inspiring the next generation.
So they built 3,970 B-29s. This particular B-29 was in a radar calibration unit. It was Snow White, the Seven Dwarfs, and the Wicked Witch. Doc was one of the Seven Dwarfs, and it's the only one remaining. So as a radar calibration unit, they tested radar, which was all new at that time. B-29s had a lot of different missions. besides dropping bombs. So this one came out late in the war in 1944. It never had the gun turrets put on it because they knew it was not going to see combat. This particular airplane stayed stateside and used for radar calibration and other testing.
So my main attention really is everything. And so on this airplane, to kind of sum it up in a nutshell, the pilots steer the airplane and run the radios. I control all the engines and propellers on that. So if you can imagine driving your car or your truck down the road, you've got the steering wheel and I'm running the brake and the gas pedal from the back seat, not watching where we're going. And that's how a B-29 works. And so what I'm watching for, especially during critical phases of flight, the four engines to make sure that they're performing the way they're supposed to. We've got the right power settings, propellers are doing what they're supposed to, they're not overspeeding, underspeeding, watching temperatures. Nothing on the airplane is automatic, it's all manually controlled. So whether it's oil temperature, cylinder head temperatures, monitoring oil pressures, everything to do with the health of that airplane is what I'm monitoring throughout the flight. And then as we get up and we cruise the altitude and pull the power back, things slow down a little bit, but it's still continuously monitoring this airplane. As the airplane turns and the propellers become unsynchronized, I'll put those back in synchronization. We're still monitoring. There's chip detector lights to detect metal in the engines. I'm watching those. Again, watching pressures, watching temperatures, watching power settings, making sure the propellers stay on speed. It's just what you do the whole flight.
So the aircraft is required a crew of 6 whenever we go fly it, pilot, co-pilot, flight engineer. Then we have 3 scanners in the back. The scanners would have been gunners in World War II, and they're watching all the stuff in the back. And they're also part of our emergency equipment, because if we have to crank the flaps down or the gear down, it is all in the rear bomb bay, and that's what the scanners do in the back. Say it's a crew airplane, we all have to work together. Pilot, co-pilot, reading the checklist, and the engineer chimes right in there on the checklist, and he's doing most of the work. He's got all the throttles and the mixtures, and the prop controls are all at his disposal. The pilots flying the airplane don't touch the throttles very much. We're calling out power settings for him to set, because he's sitting right there looking at the gauges, whereas we're busy trying to steer the airplane down the runway correctly and keep it on the runway. So we don't have time to necessarily get all 4 engines synced up together, whereas he's looking right at them, can sync them up.
One of our biggest challenges in operating a warbird obviously is cost and acquisition of parts and serviceable parts to be able to keep the airplane airworthy and in the air. And we do that by our volunteers. Our volunteers are the heroes of our program. Without these volunteers that constantly pamper and maintain and work on this airplane to keep it in tip-top shape, we can't go do what we do, and that's honoring the greatest generation. Those volunteers started in Wichita, Kansas in 2000. It took them 16 years, about 450,000 volunteer hours to put this airplane back together. Not to mention the 10 years prior to that the volunteers in California went and rescued the airplane from the China Lake Desert. So that's one of our challenges, is making sure that we're able to keep volunteers and keep crew members and continually train and get cross promotion of the information that they have in their brain, because if we don't begin to share some of that information with our current volunteers to the next generation of volunteers, our volunteer legacy will go away, and that's something we can't have. Another challenge is insurance cost and fuel cost. It costs us about $8,000 to $10,000 per flight hour to operate the aircraft. That goes into maintenance, oil, fuel, insurance, and a handful of other things. So that's one of the things that's a challenge. Another challenge is just making sure that we have the right parts. You can't go to eBay or Amazon or down the road to a parts store and buy B-29 parts. We're having to get those parts from other B-29s, from other aircraft that have the same type of parts, and those parts have to be reserviced. And so we're trying to go through a parts acquisition program right now. Another thing is just overall maintenance. There's always something with a B-29. These are old warbirds. They behave well, but sometimes they're trying to tell us something, and we have to stop and maintain the airplane on the road. And so that's always a challenge when you're out on the road and you're doing a repair or you're doing maintenance or servicing of the aircraft. Getting all the parts, getting all the tools, and everybody together to get that done on the road is a monumental effort. And our volunteers, our crew takes very good care of that process, and without those team members, we don't have Doc.
Really on that first flight, actually, that first airshow flight, what really got me was we went into a small town in New Mexico, into Clovis, New Mexico, of all places, to Cannon Air Force Base. And I was just amazed at this machine, to finally be a part of this team. And as I'm walking around the airplane, talking to people, visiting with somebody, there was an old gentleman at the back hatch, back where the APU's at, where the back end crew went in there today. And he was crying. And I wasn't briefed or trained about this kind of stuff. And so, of course, I'm going to go see if the guy's okay. And he explained to me how the last time he saw that hatch was in World War II. They were over Japan somewhere. I don't remember where he said they were. But something had happened to the airplane. He didn't know if it was a mechanical failure, they got hit. But the bailout horn came on, and he was the first one out the door. And he watched that hatch go until the airplane disappeared into the ground. He's the only one that made it out of the airplane of the crew. And so he just looked at me, he shook my hand, and then he hugged me, and he thanked me for keeping his buddy's memories alive by keeping this airplane going. And that struck something in me that changed my life completely. And it was after that it got continually more involved in the maintenance of the airplane, the operation of the airplane. I was Fifi's maintenance officer for 12 years, actually. And then, of course, this dock got put together with that, helped obviously with that project. So this is actually my 20th year of flying and maintaining B-29s. And again, I've never forgot that very first trip with these things. I knew what it meant to me, but I had no idea of the significance of what it meant to the greatest generation and to their families afterwards. So here I am. I'll do this as long as I can.
We are so very honored and blessed to do what we do. I like to tell people that we have the greatest job on the planet, and that's to fly a B-29 around the country, honor our brave men and women who serve our nation today and who have served in the past, and then also carry on the legacy of our volunteers over the past several decades, and then obviously carry on the legacy and the story of the greatest generation and teach new generations why this airplane is important, what it did, its masterpiece of technology. It was the first all-electric airplane, the first pressurized bomber, really put Wichita, our hometown, on the map as being the aviation capital of the world. And so we're so very honored to be able to do that across the country, and we hope to continue to do that for decades and generations to come.
So as you can imagine, this is a huge undertaking to keep this airplane going. If you want to come out and help with that, you can come take a ride on Doc. We travel around the country. We'll have a schedule put out for next year, and we'll be at an airport near you probably at some point. And you can sign up online or come out to the airport, and you can actually buy a ride on the B-29. We're all volunteers. We do this because we want to see this to continue to fly. So we're all volunteers, so the money all goes directly right back into the aircraft. So appreciate you coming out and taking a ride.
A big thank you to the crew that flies and maintains Doc and makes these rides possible. And thank you for watching today this flight in the B-29. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please hit like and subscribe to my channel. And special thank you as always to my supporters on Patreon who very generously help make this possible. See you next time, and see you next year in Oshkosh again. Bye-bye.